SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease joins us live now from the UN headquarters in New York. Sherwin, welcome. Just take us through the key take-homes from this emergency session that allowed for different perspectives, as we heard a bit.
Well, let's choreograph that for you. What did we hear? The Secretary-General essentially talking about the need to end this tit-for-tat violence. He said it must stop as time is running out. He's appealing for a ceasefire, Mfundo, both in Gaza, the long-standing war in Gaza that will mark a one-year anniversary on October 7th, and of course, a ceasefire that the United States and France is pushing for in the main in Lebanon. Then you hear the Israeli ambassador, Danny Danon, saying that Israel will defend itself. We will act. This was an unprecedented act of aggression that Iran would pay a heavy price for. Anything less, he says, would be complicity. Cue the Iranian ambassador. Further escalation could be avoided if Israel stopped the war in Gaza. But Iran is fully prepared, Mfundo, to take further defensive measures to protect its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Other countries essentially agree there must be de-escalation, that you're seeing a uptick in rhetoric, in heated rhetoric between the two sides that could only lead to a regional conflagration here, a regional expansion of this conflict. There's broad consensus in this UN Security Council that this violence must stop. And so what do we take away from all that rhetoric? We now sit back and wait to see if and when Israel is, as it has said, is going to respond to Iran's latest salvo here. So the takeaway is that this war will continue in the short term.
It's honestly quite astonishing to have listened to both warring factions, whether you listen to Iran or you're listening to Israel. Both believe they are victims in this specific instance, but also when you listen to Iran, they go on to criticize the UN Security Council, saying there was no condemnation. They believe that their attack is justified, it's lawful, because there's just been constant provocation. We heard from the representative there even going on to list some of the provocative acts, be it the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, being the bombing at the consulate in Damascus in Syria. So both sides, when listening to them, they are victims.
In addition to Lebanon's ambassador really sort of trying to dig a little deeper into the way the word terrorist is used, right? What is a resistance fighter and what is a terrorist? And I think what you're speaking to here is both sides complaining that the Security Council has been ineffective in terms of the national interests that it seeks to achieve in terms of this multilateral fora. Iran, for example, feels that Israel has not been held accountable for what it views as its illegality, the war in Gaza, the violations that are well documented of international humanitarian and international human rights law in Gaza. Its invasion of a sovereign country now in terms of its so-called limited incursion into southern Lebanon. And then on the Israeli side, they feel that Hamas has not been named in a council resolution condemning its actions vis-a-vis the attack on October 7th last year. So everybody's got a gripe. Everybody has a national interest it seeks to put forward in reaching consensus and collective agreement in terms of the way forward. But unfortunately, those roads are not intersecting anywhere in the Security Council. You have these opposing views and a council based on vetoes that is unable to bring the parties to coalesce around a particular issue, be that the ceasefire that is much needed in Gaza, that everybody, including those negotiating, led by the United States, agree must happen, or whether it's a ceasefire in southern Lebanon, and whether they must all as a collective observe Resolution 1701 that was adopted back in 2006 that essentially creates a buffer zone between Hezbollah and Israel in southern Lebanon. That Security Council resolution is being violated daily by both sides here since, of course, the Gaza conflict. So you have a very ineffectual council here that is taking the rap for everybody's gripe and seemingly unable, based on its unreformed nature, to move this process forward.
And Israel has decided to act now on its displeasure, taking it to the next level by deciding to ban the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres.
Yeah, so we just heard a fulsome reaction from Guterres' spokesperson, Stefan Dujarric. Let me just read a little bit of what he says. He says, this is just one more attack on a UN staff member, essentially a broad reference here to the number of UN casualties and the over 200 UNRWA, UN humanitarian workers that have been killed in Gaza in the almost 12 months of this conflict. We see this, he says, as a political statement by Prime Minister Netanyahu. He says the UN continues to cooperate and have contacts with Israel at the operational level and at other levels. The UN does not recognize the concept of persona non grata against its staff. Dujarric, the spokesperson, adding that this was the first time in his 24 years at the UN that he's seen this type of statement leveled against the Secretary-General. Look, the Secretary-General had no plans to travel to Israel anytime soon. There's been a lot of tension since his initial comment in the Security Council soon after that October 7th attack, where he said the attack didn't happen in a vacuum. Israel took great umbrage to that statement, and since then the relationship between Guterres in particular and the Israeli government has not been very good. But as Dujarric explained, levels of contact still continue. His special envoy, Tor Venezuelan, is based in Jerusalem, the Middle East coordinator for peace. And so contacts continue, but certainly Israel has a bullseye on the Secretary-General here in terms of, let me reframe, a political bullseye on Guterres and the UN saying they don't recognize this notion of persona non grata.
Unprecedented times. But Sherwin, given that the solution here is unlikely to come from the Security Council, all eyes then remain on whether the United States can deliver a ceasefire agreement for both Lebanon and Gaza, given the leverage it has over Israel. Did the US envoy provide any additional clarity in this regard?
She did. She said that they're still working on a negotiated settlement. She also talked about the need to uphold the prescripts of Resolution 1701 that creates that buffer zone between Hezbollah and Israel in southern Lebanon. Their effort last week, there was an announcement from the White House that they had put forward a proposal just as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was flying to the United States, to New York, to speak in the General Assembly. They had put forward a temporary 21-day temporary ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel to allow for a political off-ramp here, but none of the parties, Israel in the main, have accepted those negotiations, and that really does speak here to perhaps in an election here, right? Who knows what the dynamics Israel is playing at in terms of what is happening domestically in the United States, and whether this current administration has the kind of leverage and space to really impose on Israel its will here. That certainly doesn't seem to be the case. I'll tell you what the Russian ambassador said. He accused Washington of essentially negotiating with itself. You will also recall that in June of this year, the Security Council essentially endorsed the Biden peace proposal in terms of that ceasefire for hostage deal that was being negotiated at the end of June. It is now October, and that deal that the Council was forced in a way to accede to and to support, that deal is still not accepted by both parties. So U.S. influence in this moment, in this cycle, certainly appears to be waning here, particularly its leverage over Israel.
Sherwin, thank you very much for that reportage. That's SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce Peace at the UN headquarters in New York for us.